It gives me great pleasure to rise in support of this bill because it represents a step in the right direction for the people of Deakin, who have called for an end to the government waste that has plagued the last 6 years. Indeed, this is a day where we can draw a line in the sand, and it ends a sad and sorry chapter of the failed former government. It ensures that the Commissioner of Taxation doesn't make any further tax bonus payments. There will be no more $900 stimulus cheques. The Australian people know that the Rudd-Gillard government's 6 years of chaos, waste and mismanagement delivered higher taxes, record boat arrivals and debt and deficit as far as the eye can see. The $900 stimulus cheques are a poignant example of how the Labor Party turned fiscal strength into weakness in just 6 years.
The member for Deakin has the call.
The problem is these so-called stimulus cheques have continued to be sent out as long as 5 years after the global financial crisis. Indeed, these $900 payments rank alongside the home insulation scheme and the school halls rip-off as a benchmark for Labor waste, and I'd say to the member for Fraser that that is a pretty high bar to meet by Labor standards. But we're entering a new era in Australia, an era of fiscal responsibility and prudent financial management. It's a change in direction that the people in my electorate of Deakin appealed for when they went to the ballot box last September. They had, with dismay, watched the country's debt spiral out of control, and they've made their feelings well and truly clear to me time and time again, and they continue to do so. The release of the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook in December revealed the dire state that Labor left the budget in. We've heard these figures before, but let me repeat them so that they can truly sink in, because they clearly haven't sunk in yet. The forecast was a $47 billion deficit in 2013-14 and $123 billion worth of cumulative deficits over the forward estimates. Since the release of PFO just a few months earlier in August, the budget position had deteriorated by $68 billion over the forward estimates. Now, that might just be a rounding error by Labor standards, but on this side of the House, that is a huge problem. Labor's legacy to this country was a budget debt that would not return to surplus within the 10-year medium-term projections, with gross debt projected to rise to $667 billion over the same time. And I know the Labor Party rely on these figures becoming so big and so amorphous that nobody can truly grapple them. But this is debt that will be intergenerational, that our children will be required to pay off. And as the member for Deakin, I will not look at the school children in my electorate knowing that the legacy we are giving them is debt that they will have to pay off as taxpayers. So something had to change, and it has. The adults are back in charge of the country's finances, and we recognise that the budget we've inherited is unsustainable. Like the Deakin families and businesses who work hard to manage their household budgets and business bottom lines, the Coalition is committed to prudent management of the budget. We appreciate on this side of the House that the government is a custodian of the hard-earned dollars of Australian taxpayers, and we're not going to squander their money. It is not government's money, it is their money. And when I'm out in the community, I feel great pride in being able to give my electors in Deakin that assurance. And why is this so important? Why is building that faith so important? It's important because each time we ask something of Australians, each time we take money out of their pockets, we must be able to look them in the eye and tell them that their hard-earned money that we've taken will make our country better. And I think your average Deakin resident and nearly all Australians are selfless and love their country and don't begrudge working hard and paying their fair share of tax. But for people who are used to managing their own household or business budgets, examples of waste such as the so-called $900 stimulus cheques sent to dead people and people living overseas is something they just will not accept, and neither should we in this place. The reason for this is that Australians innately understand that you can't live beyond your means, and even worse, you can't waste borrowed money. Wasting borrowed money is exponentially worse than wasting your own money. And I'll give you an example of this sensibility from an interaction I had recently in the electorate. I was visiting a small business, as I regularly do, and in this case it was a florist. I was given a very excellent tour and asked the owner some obligatory questions about customers and broadly how business was going. Business was pretty good, but I was told that in order to remain strong, they really had to keep a very close eye on costs. It seemed like a pretty reasonable and sensible approach, and something that probably isn't new to people on this side of the house. But it truly hit home to me when I walked out of the florist with a pen that I'd borrowed from the owner, Helen. You see, I have a pretty bad habit of forgetting pens that I borrow, and at times I inadvertently take them, and I can assure you it's always inadvertent. In any event, as I was walking out with Helen's pen, she exuberantly gestured for me not to take another step. She asked me, am I forgetting something, and pointed to the pen in my hand. As I sheepishly handed it back to Helen, she reminded me that when she said she kept an eye on every single cost, she meant it. If I'd walked out with that pen, they'd just have to buy another one. Now, I know, and we all know on this side of the house, that the owner of the florist, Helen, was really just trying to make a point with me. But it was a point very well made. In her business, they have to keep track of all costs, even those that may seem negligible to us, because a thriving business doesn't happen by accident. So when the member for Fraser gets up and scoffs that these are small savings, that these don't make a difference, it highlights the utter disregard for taxpayers' money that they had when they were in government. Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, how dare he get up here and talk about taxpayers' money as though it doesn't matter, because it's a rounding error, it's small. That's why we've got projected debt going to $667 billion. It's that kind of attitude which has pervaded the other side of the chamber, particularly when they were in government. And what Helen's actions reinforced to me when I was in that florist that day is that every wasted dollar is another dollar of revenue that must be found in her business, or another dollar borrowed. In our case, it's another dollar that we must take out of taxpayers' pocket or borrow from lenders overseas. So when people saw in my electorate that their taxpayer dollars were being wasted so flagrantly, it rightly made them angry. So while there's a lot of work ahead to bring the budget back under control, bills such as the one before us today help to address the waste. And what outstanding waste it was, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. As a new member of this place, I wasn't fortunate enough to be present when my colleagues voted against the former Labor government's second stimulus package. They voted against the imprudent cash splash, including payments to be authorised by the Tax Bonus Act, which this bill is seeking to repeal, because it was poorly targeted, failed to support employment, and of course it was unaffordable. The member for Fraser didn't understand that. Unfortunately for the Australian people, the coalition was proved right in voting against that second stimulus. Then, as now, the coalition took a responsible approach to looking after the economic interests of the nation. It's estimated that to date some $7.7 billion of borrowed government money was spent on doling out stimulus checks to people who never asked them, and in most cases thought the money could be more wisely invested. And that was certainly the feedback that came to me regularly on the campaign trail. Australians weren't going to say no to a cheque sent in the mail, but instinctively they understood that it was not good bang for their buck. And now our children will repay that. Although most of the so-called stimulus cheques were made in 2009, a staggering number of these payments were not made at the time of the global financial crisis. The late banking of cheques and issuing of amended income tax assessments for the 2007-2008 year resulted in more than 480,000 payments, totalling more than $400 million being made in the subsequent years, right up until now, close to 5 years. But presumably, based on the comments by the member for Fraser preceding mine, that's small change. That's only $400 million. That's not a problem. We just find that behind the cushions of the couch. Well, I would tell the member for Fraser that $400 million is an extraordinary amount of money, and the opportunity cost of that money having been wasted is an outrage. So when I reflect on how that money could have been better spent, I think about roads, hospitals and other infrastructure that would help our nation prosper. And quite frankly, I and my colleagues feel appalled, and most importantly my constituents feel appalled. Not enough Australians know that these stimulus cheques continue to be doled out. Last financial year alone, there were 15,000 cheques issued that totalled approximately $13 million of borrowed money. I wish the member for Fraser was here to ask him, is that enough? Is $13 million enough, or is that really not important? Because his comments suggested that really wasn't worth the parliament's time. And as the parliamentary secretary to the Treasurer said, the member for Moncrieff, in his second reading speech, and I quote, "If it were not bad enough that the government was borrowing money to pay for $900 stimulus cheques 4 years on after the height of the GFC, it is worse that these stimulus payments continue to be sent to taxpayers living overseas." And I make that point again because it's important. It shows how badly these payments were targeted. It was a cash splash in the true sense of the word. So, in order to stimulate the Australian economy, the Labor Party thought it prudent to send cheques to people living overseas. Even worse, and I've said it a couple of times, but I think it's important to reiterate this point, cheques were sent to people long deceased and backpackers travelling through Australia. The numbers are approximately 16,000 payments were sent to people living overseas, which equated to $14 million. And it beggars belief, as it does to the payments made to deceased people, both back in 2009 and since, that more than 21,000 payments totalling more than $18 million, including 40 payments this year, were made. But the problem with Labor is that so many of the members opposite are career politicians who work their way up through the union movement, and they have no idea how to prudently manage money. You see, these union leaders become so accustomed to spending other people's money, they never learn the discipline required to manage a budget. So if any of the members opposite want to visit Helen, the florist, with me, I'll take you there and she'll give you a good lesson. As I said, the Coalition opposed the second stimulus package, recognising it for the ineffective package that it was, and we condemned the litany of wasteful payments that have been made in the wake of its introduction. Given that so much time has marched on since the GFC and in any case the flawed payments, there is simply no need for the ATO to make any more payments. Further, payments are plainly unwarranted and a waste of taxpayers' money. And the great thing about today's legislation is that it brings an end to these payments. Acting Deputy Speaker, Labor inherited a $20 billion surplus but left behind a projected $47 billion deficit. Labor turned nearly $50 billion in the bank into a projected debt of $667 billion, the fastest deterioration in debt in dollar terms and as a share of GDP in modern Australian history. The coalition government is delivering what the Labor Party could never do: prudent management of the budget, and we're identifying opportunities such as the one before us today to end the waste and find savings. I made a commitment to the people of Deakin at last year's election that as part of a coalition government I would help address Labor's record of waste and mismanagement. Today's bill is just one measure that I am proud to be supporting to deliver on that election commitment.